Hey, Lizzie.
That is such a
These
hallway.
middle schoolers are so
They're
funny.
all that.
It is such an interesting hallway to walk through.
Some run, some walk.
Girls. Hey, when's the play? And are you involved?
Is that when we're having a banquet for soccer? Yeah, but she's starting to fighting against time for all the managers. Buddy? Yeah, and then he sent in 3 days to Lilac, which is not enough to school. This is a 3 of those days, and then Lilac.
As you're doing this, girls, I'm going to be collecting this assignment. Take note. Question 2. Question 13 is asking you to use both documents to answer the question. So just make sure you read instructions really carefully on both of these questions. Ay vey. Hey, Sadie. Khalil, got something for you. So, as I pointed out a moment ago, I want you to work on these 2 questions to open today, but take note, the second question is asking you to draw a comparison using both documents. So it's you need to make sure you're following the instructions. I'm going to shut up and let you read it, but I'll give you about 7 minutes on this to open class today. And I will be collecting it, so put your name on it. Katie's here today. What about Alyssa?
She's here.
She is here?
So, give yourself
Alyssa, coming at you. So we got 3, 6, 7, 8. Blake? So in that.
Sorry for the interruption, I have an announcement.
Of course.
Indoor track bus is leaving at 2:30 today. Indoor track bus is leaving at 2:30 today.
I don't know, I've been coming from my car.
So you got 2 stimulus, 2 multiple choice questions, and question 14, question 13 is asking you to draw on information using both documents. Use both documents for question 13. Take a look, girls and guys, this word here in document 1. Hitherto, it means before this. It means before.
to your class. Stop being so wasted.
Wow, 7th grade kind of bold, aren't they? You guys both done? All right, happy Tuesday. Report cards got home yesterday for most of you, hopefully. Make sure you take a peek at my comments. I gave each of you feedback on things you can be working on moving forward. I gave all of you a little pep talk about how workload's gonna ramp up a little bit this marking period. Most of you are in a good spot in this class through the first marking period. Stay on top of things, stay on top of your assignments. I cleaned up the board a little bit here. Friday, you have an inquisitive due, and you have a vocab quiz on chapter 12 topics. We're gonna start looking at chapter 12 today, and we're gonna talk about religion, romanticism, and reform, the 3 R's. And this is gonna be kind of a quick chapter. Hopefully we can get through this before the end of the day Friday. We talk about religion, romanticism, and reform. We're talking about the period 1800 to 1860. And we're going to open up today with religious life during the 1800s, between 1800 and 1860. We're going to key in with today specifically a revival of religion and social reforms. So if I could make an important point before we start, there is a serious connection between social reform movements which aim to hope to improve society. Not all social reforms are improvements, however, and I'll stress that, but there is a genuine linkage between people who want to improve society and people's religious beliefs. Oftentimes, reform movements were motivated by religious beliefs. Abolition to slavery. The whole idea of opposing slavery on moral grounds is often tied to people's religious beliefs. Just like we said yesterday, Southerners defended slavery because slavery was depicted in the Holy Bible. So too, Northerners are going to oppose slavery because they believe, as part of their Christian doctrine, their Christian beliefs, that slavery is immoral, slavery is wrong, slavery is evil. So we're going to look today at the Second Great Awakening and religious revival and social reform. Social reform simply means an effort to improve society by making changes. We're going to look at a number of reform movements. We're going to look at the abolitionist movement. We're going to look at the temperance movement. Does anybody remember what the temperance movement is all about? The temperance movement was the movement to, Lizzie?
Stop excessive.
Yeah, to not just stop excessive drinking, but to ban the sale of alcohol and hard liquor. The movement to ban alcohol consumption and the sale. We're also going to look at reform movements in literature. Okay, we're going to look at prison reform. We're going to look at a number of different reforms. So let's take a peek right off the bat by looking at one of our author's videos. This is going to be on an overview on revivalism and romanticism.
In the early 19th century, the United States witnessed an emotional phase of revivalism, where Americans, especially those living along the frontier, isolated farm folk, embraced a very emotional, fervent religious tradition. At the same time, however, another movement, first originating in Europe, became quite popular in the United States, and it was called Romanticism, where more and more people were infatuated not so much with traditional religion and the Bible as a source of inspiration, but rather were being inspired by nature, assuming that God's work, God's handiwork, was represented by the beauties of nature. So two very different movements, at times intersecting, at times conflicting and contrasting, emerged during the same period in American life, and yet both of them stimulated extraordinary changes in the routine of daily life as well as in American culture. The so-called transcendentalists of New England were part of that romantic movement, and they were determined to create a flowering of American culture in the arts, in literature, in music, that represented their excitement at the inspirations of nature and the potential of the American as creator of culture. So one of the themes of 19th century American history are these two strands in American culture: fervent religious revivalism, and at the same time, a fervent cultivation of individual talent and even a pursuit of perfectionism as manifested through the Romantic movement and Transcendentalism.
All right, a lot to kind of unpack there, but let's make an attempt at doing so, and we'll do it in, I think, simpler terms than our author just tried to use. Time of religious change is going to occur in the early 19th century. The early 1800s, we're going to see major religious shifts in America. Major religious shifts in America. This is a period that's known as the Second Great Awakening, and we use that term, the Second Great Awakening, to point out that during this period, this 50-year block, Americans are going to have a renewed and a revived interest in religious beliefs, but they're going to be practicing their religion in ways that are much, much different from traditional types of worship and traditional types of activities that we're going to see in the early part of our country's history and during the colonial era. During this period, the Great Awakening, we're going to see an emphasis on personal salvation and social reform. There was a connection between people doing what they could to save themselves as Christians, to do what they needed to do as Christians to earn salvation. And does everybody understand what the term salvation means in the Christian sense? To earn a spot where? In heaven, to save their souls. Salvation means to basically save their souls. And people began to feel that the path toward salvation would be toward reforming society here on earth. By making American society more humane, more Christian-like, and more moral, religious believers believed that they could attain salvation, and they did so by initiating a series of social reforms. All right, I'll give you an example of that. Okay, and it's not the only example that we'll talk about, but women, American women, during the mid-1800s, are going to spearhead a group of reformers, are going to spearhead a movement that is going to hope to abolish, as we said, the sale of alcohol because of the deleterious effects, the bad effects that alcohol had on the American household if there was a situation where a husband was an abuser of alcohol. Because women were dependent on husbands for their livelihood, because women were financially dependent on their husbands and oftentimes did not have the opportunity to earn an income of their own, if the husband was a drunkard, if the husband was had a problem with alcohol and wasted the family's money or abused the wife and the children were the people most likely to feel the effects of it. So this movement, this temperance movement, is going to be an effort by women to improve American society by banning the sale and the consumption of alcohol. Of course, the abolitionist movement is probably the better of the examples when we talk about people who want to reform society. Abolitionists want to ban slavery because they see slavery simply as unchristian. They see slavery as evil. They see slavery as immoral. And as Christians, more and more Christians in this period are going to start to speak out on the institution of slavery and speak out on the horrors of slavery. And they're going to justify their religious beliefs, and they're going to use their religious beliefs to justify this opposition to slavery. Quick video on the Second Great Awakening.
During the early 19th century, there was a second Great Awakening in American religious life. And again, like the first, it represented an effort to allow the common person to participate more actively in religious life, especially with the newer denominations such as the Baptist and the Methodist. They were much more open to ministers who did not have degrees from seminaries or from colleges. They were much more open to women participating in their congregations and in their worship services. They were much more open to African Americans.
And they were much more open to religious services outside of the traditional church environment. Okay? We're going to see a growth, and we'll hear this term a couple of times today. We're going to see the growth during the Second Great Awakening of the term revival. A religious revival, or a revival meeting, is basically a meeting that occurred during the period that we're talking about, in which traveling ministers would basically travel around the countryside, especially in rural areas and backcountry areas where populations were sparse, and they would basically take their religious service on the road, and they would set up a tent, and people from miles around would come and hear what were called revival meetings. These were very spontaneous and oftentimes very, very well attended and overflow crowds of people gathering to hear a minister or to hear a member of a particular denomination talk about their religious beliefs and talk about how, as Americans, they were obligated to practice their faith in a way that was going to enrich the lives of not only themselves and their community, but help to enrich the lives of all Americans. So this is important. these revival meetings. When I was in the Army, I went to a revival meeting. I served in the South for a while, in the American South, and I went to a tent meeting in the late 1980s when I was in the service, and it was just as I described. It was basically a tent that was set up in the middle of a field, and people literally from 25 miles came around. It was a 4-hour church service under a tent. A lot of hand-holding, a lot of singing, a lot of praying, and it was very non-traditional in the religious sense. If any of you have ever been to church on a regular basis, I'm a Catholic, I go to Catholic church, and Catholic church is very regimented. You stand at certain times, you kneel at certain times, you genuflect at certain times, there's a time and a place for everything in a Catholic church, and you really don't deviate from it. Well, these revival meetings are very spontaneous. They are very, well, how do I, just what happens, happens. No one has a diagram as to what's going to happen. You might pray for a little bit, and then you might be singing and speaking to the person next to you, or sharing an experience, a religious experience with the crowd. People from the crowd, there might be a healing ceremony at some of these revivals. People who might have been afflicted with a particular disease might come and be prayed upon. We would use the term called laying of the hands. If you were a minister, oftentimes these ministers would place their hands on a person's head or on their shoulder as a way of trying to cure them, or hoping to, praying that someone could be cured of their affliction, their illness, their sickness. These were very, very spontaneous, and they were very, very popular during this period. Revival meetings, tent meetings, and there would be a circuit. Kind of like, how many of you are involved with the fair circuit, with 4-H and the county fairs? The Washington County Fair, the county fair here in Rensselaer County, the Altamont Fair. Well, during the summertime in New York, we have the fair circuit. Well, back during this period of time, there was the revival circuit, where you would have people coming through towns on a regular basis, setting up tents on the outskirts of towns in open areas where people could come and meet and share their religious beliefs with others.
It's being a part of religious life. So the Second Great Awakening, again, was intended to break down the traditional hierarchy of religion and allow people to be more equal in their participation in religious life and in their approach to salvation. Sometimes it was called free will Christianity, because the revivalists of the Second Great Awakening emphasized to people that salvation is your choice. If you believe, if you ask Christ to be your Savior, it will happen. You didn't have to depend on a minister being in between you and Christ. It was direct Christianity.
Can anybody point out anybody today that a religious leader today that kind of subscribes to that same belief, that a personal relationship with Christ, if you're a Christian, is important? This man is always on television. He's well, the Pope is, but the Pope is a Catholic leader, and the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church here on earth. And the Pope, while an important leader, don't get me wrong, the Pope he's the highest ranking Catholic on the planet. He's not like the revivalists that we're talking about here. We're talking about leaders who really did not point to church membership as the most important part of Christianity. They pointed to a person's individual relationship with God as most important. And the one that comes to my mind today, more than the Pope, is a leader, a Protestant leader named Franklin Graham. Franklin Graham is the son of a very, very popular evangelist from 50 years ago named Billy Graham, and he's in charge of a charity today called Samaritan's Purse, which basically goes around the country and around the world, and they help people who experience natural disasters and floods and fires and etc. And he's a religious leader, and he talks about a lot of these same ideas about a personal relationship with Christ. And that's kind of what these revival meetings would have been like, stressing now, absolutely religion and church membership would be important to these people at these revivals, but their relationship with God was much different from people who were limited to just attending church on a particular Sunday. They were much, much more personal in their relationship with God. And that's important to note. Let's continue on as we look at our next slide. Slide number 3. Key features of the Second Great Awakening. Well, we've got a 50-year block between 1790 and 1840. It renewed religious fervor and evangelical Protestant revival. So religious fervor basically means religious excitement. Religion took on a new excitement for people during this period. Not to say that religion was not important before 1790, but it took a new importance. It took on a new importance after 1790. And evangelical Protestant revival. There was this belief, and when you hear that term evangelical, this is a real important term that you need to understand. Christians are obligated to evangelize. I just used that in a sentence. I just used it in a sentence. Tell me, context clues, what it means. If Christians are obligated to evangelize their faith, what does that call, Palin, for them to do?
Spread it.
What?
Spread it.
Absolutely. Christians are called on to spread the word of their faith. And that becomes very important during the Second Great Awakening. People sharing their religious experience with others and encouraging other people to experience it with them. And this is going to be a valuable aspect of the Second Great Awakening. Also, a key emphasis is going to be on free will and individuals' ability to seek salvation. Free will is basically the belief that our salvation is entirely up to us and the choices that we make. As human beings, we have a choice between choosing good and choosing bad. We have a choice between choosing good or choosing evil. And invariably, our salvation, according to Christians who subscribe to these beliefs, Christians and their salvation is determined by their choices that they make. One, Christians have to have faith. They have to believe that Jesus is God's Son, and that Jesus walked on this earth for 33 years, 2,000 years ago, and that Jesus died on the cross, and that Jesus, when he died on the cross, a key component of Christianity is accepting that Jesus resurrected from the dead. He died and came back to life, and along with free will and the faith that you have that Jesus is God's Son, along with free will, salvation becomes a very personal aspect of the Christian faith. If you have faith and you perform good deeds, if you have faith and you make good choices as human beings, you can achieve salvation. So emphasis on free will and individuals' ability to seek salvation is important. Many religions, many Christian religions before this, free will was a foreign concept. Free will, in other words, there were only a limited number of souls that could obtain salvation. So free will, I'm going to use a word here I've used before. Free will does this to Christianity in a way, and it provides hope to a lot of people who before this might not have had hope. Free will democratizes Christianity. Meaning what? Free will democratizes Christianity. Any takers? When we talked about Andrew Jackson a couple of weeks ago, we said Jackson was a champion of democratization when it came to voting rights. Democratization of religion with Christianity is going to mean that more and more people, Liz, now can feel that they can obtain what? Salvation. Salvation. It didn't matter how rich you were, how poor you were. It didn't matter whether you were black. It didn't matter whether you were white. It didn't matter whether you were male or female. Okay? If you believed and you had faith and you exercised free will, you could obtain salvation. Also, key features of the Second Great Awakening: rise of emotional, enthusiastic preaching and camp meetings. I talked about the camp meetings or the revivals. I had my whole life in the Catholic Church, Catholic priests, are about as conservative and in terms of their speaking habits and in terms of the way they speak. They'll speak at a pulpit, they'll speak at a lectern, and they could be dry, they could be very boring, they're frankly, I've had priests that have put me to sleep in church with their sermons. These camp meetings, there was no sleeping, and not because they wouldn't let you, but because they were so animated and the speakers were so passionate and excited about what they were talking about that everyone was involved. There was emotional, enthusiastic preaching and camp meetings, and everybody in the crowd, along with the minister, along with the church leader, everybody played a role. There was no opportunity for people to doze off. It was like a fever. These camp meetings literally were like a fever, and they spread from region to region. This increased religious pluralism and new denominations. When we talk about pluralism, we're talking about the idea that more and more religious groups began to reach out to people in these same ways. More and more denominations or more and more Christian sects, S-E-C-T-S, more and more Christian sects or groups are going to be able to reach out to believers. This is important too in rural areas. Why are tent meetings kind of a natural for rural areas in the backcountry, Dylan?
There's not as many people.
There's not as many people, and there's not the opportunity to see as many what?
Buildings or churches.
Church buildings, okay? Church buildings were not as frequent or as common in rural areas as they were in towns and cities. So these tent meetings, these revival meetings are going to be an opportunity for people to worship in a different environment. Let's take a look at our second video on the Great Awakening. Got an Ed Puzzle clip on this that'll come in handy, I think.
Beginning in the late 18th century and lasting for 50 years, America underwent a wave of religious revivals known as the Second Great Awakening. It was the largest outpouring of religious sentiment since the American Revolution.
What was the Second Great Awakening? The wake-up time for all Americans, the largest spike of religious feeling since the Revolution, where the USA gained independence from Britain, or the laws that made Christianity illegal in the U.S. Largest spike in religious feelings since the Revolution. That was called the Great Awakening. It wasn't called the First Great Awakening when it happened, but historians will go back to that period right after the Revolution, and they'll call that the Great Awakening, and this period in the 1790s and through 1840 will be called the Second Great Awakening.
Just after the Revolution, the percentage of church membership in America was not that great, but it increased over fivefold in the course of the 19th century. What happened is that Protestantism, which is based on individual interpretation of the Bible, when it was mingled with the idea of religious toleration and separation of church and state, suddenly it was liberated completely.
The Second Great Awakening replaced the old Puritan religion of New England and its emphasis on original sin. Instead, the new religion stressed that by taking personal responsibility and doing hard work, anyone could achieve salvation. With this optimistic message,
what kind of values might have been part of the Second Great Awakening? God is always angry at us, anxiety and sadness, fear or nervousness, or kindness, patience, and honor. What? You say the last one, kindness, patience, and honor. You'd be correct.
the Methodist and Baptist churches went through explosive growth periods. Thousands of people turned up for emotional revival meetings where entire communities would join together to repent their sins.
These preachers would get up and give hellfire sermons and also hopeful sermons as well, but very, very passionate, emotional, full of anecdotes, even humor, colloquial expression, and they would reduce a lot of their audiences to not only tears but also to dancing, and a lot of people had what they called the jerks, where they would jerk just uncontrollably. They would speak in tongues. It was an extraordinarily emotional kind of heartfelt religion.
In towns along the newly built Erie Canal in upstate New York, a Presbyterian evangelist named Charles G. Finney held so many fiery revival meetings that the area became known as the Burned Over District. Finney and other preachers encouraged Christians to work to achieve perfection here on earth, and their message inspired a new reform movement that swept across America.
So, Second Great Awakening was very, very significant in New York State as the video said along the Erie Canal route. So significant was it that these revival meetings were called the Burned Out route. The burned, meaning the religious revivalism spread like a fire across the Erie Canal. And we're talking the Erie Canal goes from Albany all the way out to Buffalo, New York. So the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, is going to be very significant in New York as well. Let's talk about the camp meetings, and we'll close. We'll try to get a couple more slides in. The rise of camp meetings are going to occur. And when we talk about camp meetings, we're talking about these religious revivals, large outdoor gatherings for preaching and conversion. Not like a traditional church. How many of you go to church or have been to church in your lifetime? Okay. I'm assuming most of you have been to a church with a building and a steeple and a cross on the top and pews, places where you sit and places where you stand. Okay. These revival meetings were outdoors in tents. There were no chairs. Okay. People were on their feet. And if they weren't on their feet, they were on their knees praying. They might have, they would bring family for the entire day. They would bring food. They might have meals at these revival meetings. Sometimes they lasted several days with very passionate, emotional sermons and hymns. What is a hymn? H-Y-M-N-S. It's a religious song. It's a religious song. Attracted thousands of attendees, especially on the frontier, especially in the backcountry. Most of your people that lived in developing towns and cities at this point are going to practice religion in a church building in their town and city. So it wasn't like you had to live in the frontier to go to these revival meetings, but chances were that most of the attendees were going to be from the frontier. Oftentimes, city folk, townsfolk might attend just to kind of get a feel for what all the buzz was, what all the talk about these ceremonies were all about. There was a great interest, even among traditional religious. There's probably a little jealousy there too. Many times, priests and ministers from traditional churches would look at the revival meetings as competition for members and for donations. Oftentimes, churches or formal church buildings are dependent on their parishioners, on their members for upkeep, to maintain the building, to pay the minister's salary. So oftentimes there was jealousy among the traditional ministers who had their own flock or their own group of parishioners. When they went to see these meetings, they were captivated at the way that people really gravitated toward these revival meetings, toward these camp meetings. It provided social opportunities in isolated rural areas. These camp meetings were important because it brought people together at a time when, if you lived in rural America, you might not have an opportunity to see 1,000 people, 1,500 people, 2,000 people under a tent. If you lived in rural America, you were very much isolated. You might have no one around your house for literally miles if you lived in rural America. These camp meetings would bring people together, and it would provide socialization opportunities for people who were used to living kind of off the grid, to use a term they probably didn't use then, but we would use it today. Most rural Americans that live far away from towns and cities were kind of isolated, and this gave them an opportunity to experience their religion with large groups of people, like-minded large groups of people. And I kid you not when I tell you that these camp meetings oftentimes were much more democratic in another way as well. Many of these camp meetings allowed women, allowed African Americans, allowed children to play a role in the meetings and in the sermons. So they truly, in many ways, especially in this period of the Second Great Awakening, they truly are going to be an avenue for people to experience their religious belief around people from many different backgrounds. Okay, democratization of religion. All right, democratization of religion. That's an important aspect of this. One more slide. All right, one more slide. Let's do this. Making good progress. Other new religious movements. We're going to see the emergence of new American-born religious groups, starting with Mormonism, starting with the Mormon Church, which is going to be founded by Joseph Smith in 1830. Joseph Smith founded the Mormon Church. They're alive and well today. Most Mormons today live in the great state of what? Utah. Okay, but Joseph Smith founded it back east in New York, actually, in 1830, and the only reason that the Mormons ended up in Utah is because their beliefs were so condemned by Christians that Mormons were pretty much forced to leave everywhere they settled until they could find a place near a desolate lake in Utah, the Great Salt Lake. Mormons were hated, particularly for one belief that they had, and Christianity really couldn't accept this belief. What belief am I referring to?
More than one God.
Polygamy. Not more than one God, more than one wife. Okay, early Mormons practiced polygamy. Early Mormons practiced polygamy. When I tell you men could have 5, 10, 12 wives, that was originally a Mormon belief. And Christians were so opposed to having Mormons in their midst, Christians were so opposed to that one man, one woman, they forced Mormons to get out of Dodge. More on that tomorrow.